Welcome everybody. I'm Peter McPhee from the University of Melbourne, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with my colleague Professor Colin Jones from Queen Mary, University of London. It's the morning for Colin, it's the evening for me. There's 11 hours difference, but we're delighted that we're able to be in conversation thanks to modern technology. I want to thank the editorial board of H France for encouraging this salon. And particularly I want to thank four of our colleagues who've contributed essays to it. David Andrus, Michel Billard, Hervé Levé and Marisa Linton, who've all written essays especially for the Salon. These are new essays, fresh essays, I think very stimulating ones indeed, and certainly have been important prompts for me and Colin in the conversation that we're going to have about the Robespierre Problem, which has been with us, of course, ever since July 1794. There has always been deep division and debate about how to make sense of that man. Of course, historical biographers have a fundamental problem, or several problems. One is, of course, that the people we write about are unable to answer back when we say that we've got them right or understood them or we've asked our questions. We can only imagine their responses. They are unable to correct us. Another difficulty, of course, is that because we normally know the broad outlines of someone's life, it's very easy for us to look back and construct their lives as a series of stepping stones, some sort of inexorable progress towards their eventual demise, when in fact their life may have been lived in a time of uncertainty and confusion. They had no idea where their choices might take them. Those problems are particularly acute in the case of Maximilien Robespierre, because as soon as he was executed in July 1794, he became the target of rumour, of accusation, some of it preposterous. And even though ever since his death there have been people who've wanted to defend him, the great weight of opinion has always, of course, been about the monster Robespierre rather than the saint Robespierre. Such has been the division. I think that sometimes historians have lost their sense of the need, first and foremost, to try and understand someone in the past rather than to decide whether they're a good person or a bad person. That we need to keep in mind that the objective is to try and make sense of a complex, difficult life. And that's what we're seeking to do in this conversation, what we're seeking to do in this H France Salon. Colin, I wonder if we might begin the conversation by listening to what you have to say about, I guess, what is in a way one of the most fundamental divisions between historians when they try and understand Robespierre. And that is, if you look at the 5 years of his life from 1789 onwards, from the time he was a deputy at the States General, in order to make sense of the trajectory that he takes over the next 5 years, historians have often divided between those who would place much more emphasis on the force of circumstance, the way that in Marisa Linton's term, the revolution makes this man as he makes the revolution, or whether you would agree with other historians, Jonathan Israel more recently, I suppose, who would put much more weight on his ideology, on his the particular way of understanding the world, or are you happier with some sort of combination of those things?
Yeah, well, first of all, Peter, can I say how nice it is to be chatting here at these strange times, and thank you also to everyone on H France and to, obviously, as you mentioned, the four contributors. I guess as someone who started out working on the French Revolution under Richard Cobb, Robespierre has always been with me and throughout my career, and I think it's very interesting that you get four experts talking about Robespierre with three very neatly set out questions by you. And the responses are incredibly varied.
Yes.
I mean, everyone, I think, doesn't take seriously the monster argument. We realize it's much, much more complicated than that, even though we realize that the monster literature after his death provides us much of the information which we base our knowledge of his early life and some of his early part of his career. So I think that there's that to say as well. I think also the other thing which complicates it for historians is he is in some ways typical of his generation of politicians, but also a standout version of it, that he tells the story of his life. I mean, this is a big thing in the revolution. People prove their revolutionary probity by talking about their revolutionary career. This autobiographical narrative, which he gets going quite early in the revolution, but it builds up right through the, right down to his death, is a complicating factor because, of course, we can't take it as truth. I mean, like everyone, when we recall our life, we probably put ourselves under a better light in certain circumstances than others. He's presenting himself in this version of what he did, what his motives were. Historians haven't picked up on it enough, I think, but he does lie, actually. He does tell fibs about the past and about his past in particular. So we have to be very careful, if you like, at that the quality of evidence we derive from his own speech, even though as with the propaganda stuff, the monstrous stuff after his death, you know, we have to be duly careful about that as well. But I think one of the big things which adds to the enormity of the puzzle of Robespierre is that he seems to change so much. He goes into the revolution. You'd say he's Mr. Ordinary. And attempts by some historians to make him out as extraordinary, I think, fail. That people say, well, he was orphaned, and that made him very psychologically mixed up. A lot of people are orphaned in the 18th century. The demographic regime produces lots of orphans. It only produces one, Robespierre. He works in the provinces. He's a professional attorney. He builds up a bit of a reputation as a sort of pro bono, sticking up for the poor. He uses the sort of pretty sentimental rhetoric. But that's all characteristic of his class and his type of person. And then he goes into the revolution, with values which many of us would share today. I mean, democratic, egalitarian, whistleblowing against corruption in high places, a sort of sense of social justice, sense of virtue, but very much moderated by the feeling of virtue. And then he changes in the revolution, even though he's seeming not to change. I love the idea of that Dave Andres in his thing said, well, the thing about Robespierre is everyone else changed, but he stayed true. He stays true to his language. I think that's right. But
in what ways?
Circumstances in which he's operating, ideas are changing as well.
When you say, however, that he talks a lot about himself, he doesn't talk about his pre-revolutionary life. I mean, unfortunately for that, we have to rely on very much on what others say about him, or on the speeches that he gives in courts of law, on his rather poor poetry and things like that. But certainly he constructs himself as in the image of the virtuous legislator. I mean, that's... But in what ways would you see him as changing, most importantly, across the revolution?
Yes, well, can I just say I totally agree with that. I think the take that you've got in your book is right, and Hervé Lever's work is really important in producing new documents on what he was up to in the 1780s, but also highlighting this the importance of his legal formation in the way in which he talks and everything. I think essentially Robespierre is a man of the opposition. I love Marisa Linton. I don't think I'd go along with her, but I love the way in which she compares him to Jeremy Corbyn, for your international readers. He's the very extreme left Labour politician who's just against all odds been elected leader of the Labour Party. Unlikely, I think, to lead them to election. I think if the Daily Mail gets hold of this, incidentally, Corbyn's reputation will disappear forever. French revolutionary historian compares Jeremy Corbyn to Robespierre. Finished. Toast. If that goes.
Well, of course, Robespierre has been likened to other Labour politicians, even Tony Blair.
Right. He's to compare with everyone. That's right. No, I think he does change because he changes his position as regards power. Right through the early part of the 1790s, he is essentially the figure of opposition. He's the conscience on the left, the conscience of the people against, always distrustful of power. From July 1794, he changes his position drastically, and he becomes a member of a government. If you look at his rhetoric over that last few years, he's true to his older instincts, and that he often does, and especially in the speech of 9th of Thermidor, in fact, attack the government. So he has a stance on the outside, if you like, even though accepts and fully embraces, I think, the role as being a member of the Committee of Public Safety.
Yes, I think it's
belonging to power.
Yes, and I think one of the points that David Andrews makes very forcefully is the way in which he is inherently suspicious of people with power. And of course, it catches up with him once in July 1793 he becomes part of a government. That's the conundrum that he faces. I think that what's critically important is his faith from Rousseau that he knows that the common people are inherently good, but has to face the conundrum of their behaviour when it's not, when many of them are anti or counter-revolutionary. And that is something that he seeks to resolve, I think, after the purge of leading Girondins in June 1793, where he effectively says, now the National Convention represents the people. It is the people. It is peuple. And that's the point at which it seems to me that there are a series of very important measures where he is committed to making sure that never again is the convention as vulnerable to popular intervention as it has been in May and then September 1793. That's the basis, I think, of the law of 14 Frimaire on revolutionary government. And I think it's the basis of a desire in his mind to do whatever it takes to ensure that this revolutionary people, this peuple, is lifted to the heights of its virtuous capacities or potential through things like the cult of the Supreme Being. How can we formulate a virtuous people?
Yes, I think I'd go along with a lot of that, actually. I think I would add that, again, following on this idea that he is an oppositional figure, perhaps from 1793 to 4, suddenly put into a non-oppositional context and having to think that through in the ways that you're indicating, is that his sense of opposition and what he does within power, his sense of what he does within power does change. I think when he gets into the assembly, he's assuming that by being in charge, the convention will be pure and will be noble and virtuous. He's got into power, well, if you take it back, in the Ancien Regime, he sees the problem of misuse of power being, the existing status quo. Then under the Constituent Assembly, it's always the aristocracy and their supporters. And then in the early part of the Legislative Assembly, then the Convention, he's thinking, well, they're out the way. They've been purged. Why is there still a problem? Then the Girondins are purged. He's promoted to power, and he discovers that corruption hasn't gone away. There are still problems at the heart of the government, which is his government as well. So he becomes, I think, ever more obsessed with a sense of rooting out this evil at the heart of the state, which in the past has been more visible, but now seems to him to be hidden below the surface. And this gets into the sort of plot obsession which he gets. He sees conspiracy everywhere, and of course it has been said, and it is said by many of our contributors, that there were real plots. That goes without saying. There were real conspiracies.
Yes.
I think there's an excess of concern with that in his part. And looking back, we would say that some of the people he's accusing of excess, conspiratorial plotting, etc., are trying to make a good fist of being in a very difficult situation, trying to win through for the revolution, just as much as he is as well.
So if we've got a situation then where, as Hervé Levet stresses, here's a man who is typical in all sorts of ways of the legal subculture, men who numerically dominate successive assemblies. It's fascinating how many politicians of the French Revolution were either lawyers or clergy in their education, two different ways of looking at the world. But here's a man who in many ways is typical of scores of thousands of men of similar background, similar social class, similar education, similar sensibilities, that mix of the Enlightenment, of being imbued with the classics, of a sensibility and a heightened sensibility. And yet, if we are to explain why Robespierre, people such as Timothy Taggart and Marisa Linton have put predominant stress, it seems to me, on the circumstances with which he and many other people are grappling, And there's nothing particularly unusual about Robespierre. I mean, it just happens that he's someone who, by the force of his logic, the force of his persistence, comes to be seen as, in some sense, the incorruptible, the voice of the revolution. But the Robespierre problem, in fact, is part of a much more general problem about how you understand how perhaps a Jacobin sensibility responds to a world in crisis. What would you see as particular about him?
Yes, no, I think that's very helpful, and I think it ties in with the emphasis among many recent histories of the revolution and the terror to try and pin down the role of emotion.
Yes.
In the events which are taking place, and I welcome that because I think that there's a whole sort of movement of history of emotions which is really interesting. It's doing good things and important things in history generally. I think, moreover, set in that context, I agree with you and your account. Really, Robespierre looks less extraordinary. I mean, the emotional language that he uses, other people are using, as Dave Andrews shows very neatly. But I think I'm not totally happy with the idea that it explains the irrationality of the revolution. I mean, one of the interesting work that's done, it seems to be, on the history of emotions is not making a sort of Cartesian division between rationality, which is governed by the mind, and irrationality, which is governed by the emotions, but it's trying to see how those two things work. I mean, we think here, obviously, of the work of Bill Reddy and his idea of emotives and also emotional regimes, or we could think back to the medievalist Barbara Rosenzweig with her idea of emotional communities. And in some ways, I think the Jacobins or Jacobinism could be seen as not just a pure ideology in the way that you mentioned Jonathan Israel is probably seeing it, but as a sort of emotional regime in which people live and work and experience, and sometimes, get themselves up emotionally by talking this language of emotion. It must be said that Robespierre handles that language in a very distinctive way. I mean, he's not the only person to be influenced by Rousseau by far, but the way in which he plays it, I think, is very strong. And I think so it becomes a sort of signature thing that he does. He's always, like Rousseau, putting himself on the extremes, always threatening that he would die for the fatherland, or die for his own values, if you like, rather than buckle down and accept compromise. He's not the only one, but it becomes a bit of a signature approach, I think. But
this is a really important point, because I'm one of those historians who would put a great deal of emphasis on the emotions of fear and uncertainty, anxiety. These are people who are engaged in the deadliest of wars and civil wars. These are people who I think spend much of the period after 1792 in fear of their own lives. I think one of the really important contributions that Michel Billard has made is to remind us just how many members of the National Convention lost their lives. I mean, beginning with Lepelletier and Marat being murdered, but there are several score of them. There are portraits of two of them, Marat and Lepelletier, hanging behind the President's rostrum in the National Convention, reminding deputies every day that the price of failure, if you like, in this struggle against the conspiracy that's real in the sense of war and civil war, the price that can be paid is death. And so when Robespierre refers to martyrdom, as Michel Billard stresses, there is a language of martyrdom that maybe, as you say, he voices with extraordinary persistence and passion, but many other people do, and it's a real threat to their very lives.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there is a danger of using the historiography of the emotions to use passion as something which explains away action. On the other hand, I do think these passions are very important, and trying to work how they actually operate, who shares them, how emotion is generated within the assemblies, I think is an important task for historians. And I welcome all the work that's being done in that particular sphere. Of course they're frightened. Robespierre, you're right, any more than he's the only person talking about conspiracies. He's not the only person who's frightened. Everyone's frightened, actually, and people are pretty frightened on the night of Thermidor, as we know. So it is a general factor. But of course, the other thing which really complicates it as well and makes it more interesting in a historian, but frightening at the time, is that the terror, of which of course Robespierre is in many ways a principal ideologist and theoretician, is there to frighten. And the whole point about terror is you've got to frighten people. So that here are people who are frightened, who are actually talking the language of frightening others. So it gets very, very tense and difficult inside that sort of rhetorical, but also emotional circle.
Yes, I thought it was very interesting in Levet's essay, the way that he referred to Robespierre's knowledge of Montesquieu. And Montesquieu used the term crainte as being a terrifying fear that people had, in much the same way as revolutionaries use the word terror. It has much the same force, and Montesquieu juxtaposes it with reigns of virtue and reigns of fear, that it's not something the Jacobins invent.
Yes, no, I think that's right. And I think that is an interesting speech where Robespierre talks about, and it's obviously influenced, as you say, by Robespierre, and he says, well, people talk about fear and despotism and tyranny, but this is different. This is now the tyranny and the despotism of liberty. It's a totally different but of course, once you've opened up that box, other people are going to put other interpretations on it. And so as we know, the last few months are full of people sort of nudging each other and talking in coded language, and sometimes not so coded, about the dangers of tyranny and despotism. And Robespierre's name will come up in that context quite a lot. Yeah.
So if we come to that, one of the most perplexing dimensions of all of this, of course, is from April onwards, April 1794 onwards, French revolutionary armies are beginning to win battle after battle. They win decisive battles in the south of France in May, then on the border with Belgium in June at Fleurus, obviously. And yet, May and June are months where some of the legislation, which is most difficult to comprehend, is passed. And I'm referring most famously, of course, to the law of 22nd Prairial, but also to the establishment of the Revolutionary Tribunal in Orange, the centralisation of the terror, and all the rest of it. It's always been deeply perplexing, of course, that there isn't a proportionate slackening of controls on civil liberties at the same time as the war fortunes start to improve. That if anything, it goes the other way. There are more executions, there are more trials, the laws become more repressive. Now, many historians, some of our contributors included, would explain this very much in terms of internal factionalism within the committees, struggles for power. Marxist historians would have put great emphasis on increasing tensions with the sans-culotte movement, for example, if one can call it a movement. What's your view of that conundrum?
Yeah, no, it is a conundrum. I do think we need, just as when reading Robespierre's biography, we have to be careful of ex post comments and rhetoric. I think that's true also of the fate of the war effort. I mean, it's true, Fleurus in June, a month before 9th of Thermidor, of course, is a massive victory. And we know with retrospect that was absolutely fundamental in changing the emphasis of the war from war of defense to a war of offense. People didn't know that at the time. I think there is a sense of, we are winning. There is this movement of the fraternal banquets in Paris where people want to enjoy success, which Robespierre and others are very suspicious of. I don't think, and after all, that in the 79 to 93, the France had great successes, but then followed by great reverses. So I don't think we should, the war effort thing is important without any question of a doubt, but I think we need to be a bit careful. I think that, again, I do think Robespierre has a role in this. In the last 6 weeks or so, as we know, he's absent from the Committee of Public Safety. He's absent from the convention, but though not the Jacobin club. But he, by withdrawing in that way, he is putting himself out of the actual workings of the terror and that acceleration which really gets going after the law of the 22nd of Prairial. But as well as being the ideologist and theoretician of terror, he's more than perhaps historians sometimes say, a manager of terror as well, a man who sort of sets the machine in motion. As you say, his are the fingerprints all over the Commission of Orange. He defends and fights back any opponents to the law of 22nd of Prairial. He and Saint-Just seem to be the key guys with Couthon in bringing in the police bureau of the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre himself has a big role in that, actually, in May. He plays a big role in getting people arrested and all the rest of it. That police bureau, which, of course, as we know, is one of the causes of dissension between the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security. So I think there are things going on there which are very significant. No one is saying, I don't think, in the way that people said after '94 that Robespierre was the man who was responsible for everything, his hand on the levers of power. Well, I guess maybe Jonathan Israel is saying that, but I don't,
yes.
I don't think we can take that seriously, because he seems to be almost bringing back into the debate a set of arguments about totalitarianism.
That's right.
We've worked through. I thought we were on some new ground there, so I don't accept that. But and I do think, in support of I think BR and others have done in looking at terror, it's not a unified, homogeneous movement. It's very varied. There are lots of scripts of terror. The idea that terror is Robespierre's view, in some ways, in the early part of his tenure in the Committee of Public Safety, that terror is what we prevent the people from doing, because they will be in September massacres, will be on the rule of law and everything like that. After 1794, he's putting terror at the centre of government, I think, in an important way. So I think in that shift, there is something going on. I agree, factions are absolutely fundamental. They are tied up with real action and concerted action, d'entente et bêtise, but they're also fueled by this language of conspiracy and plotting, of which Robespierre is, again, probably the past master.
Well, certainly I think a lot of current contemporary French scholarship, such as that of Michel Biard and others, is reminding us just how fractured this so-called regime of the terror is, how divided people are, and also how varied the provincial face of the terror is. I mean, there are enormous differences in the way French people experience this year. But I must say, when I look at the records of that police bureau that Robespierre certainly is involved in setting up, it's not a police bureau where Robespierre is giving instructions to people to go and arrest people for them to be tried. In fact, when I looked at those records, and he absents himself in June, and after it's been going just for a few weeks, his comments are almost invariably to the effect of, when someone is reported on an alleged conspirator, you will need more proof than hearsay, or ask so-and-so about this, whatever. Robespierre, of course, doesn't have the authority to send people to their death, even though it's something that many historians like to say, that Robespierre arrests people, Robespierre sends people to their death. One of the things that we need to bear in mind is that in September 1793, he actually jots down what comes to be called his personal catechism, some personal notes, what he thinks. It's like a to-do list for a politician, what I must do in my first term of office. And it's headed, the most important thing is to bring the French Revolution to an end as quickly as possible for the benefit of the people. And I think there's a sense in 1794 with the centralisation of the terror where Robespierre is desperately trying to impose virtue on the people and terror on its enemies in as radical and unambiguous way as possible, and that there's something of that behind the desperation with which he introduces measures or supports measures like the law of the 22nd Prairial.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think there is that intensification, if you like, and the black and white, it seems to be, as the last months go through, the black and white becomes even blacker and even whiter. In other words, the Manichaean language, which he's always deployed, even back to his legal briefs in the 1780s, where he got involved in the revolution, becomes much, much more intense. But the other thing I'd say, which I think is really important, is that the line between white and black is shifts.
Yes.
And it shifts very significantly, I think, so that the black is including all sorts of people that one would see with retrospect, but other people at the time were also saying were good revolutionaries, good Jacobins, trying to do their job, trying to get the terror done, trying to move to another regime. So I think that by the end, there's a sort of little circle of the pure, it seems to me, which isn't as extensive as he thinks, but goes along with an idealization of the terror. It's very interesting when you look at his speech on the 8th of Thermidor, which really gets the whole ball underway, really, the 9th of Thermidor. The things he says essentially are, purge everything, purge the Committee of Public Safety, purge the Committee of General Security, purge their administrations, purge the Finance Committee, perhaps bring it in-house to the Committee of Public Safety. So very much using this rhetoric of purging that the article of Michel Biard really highlights. But he also says, we've got to support the convention, we've got to support a purged, but the Committee of Public Safety, and we've got to support the Revolutionary Tribunal. He still sees that repressive side very important. And the other thing which he says on that night, he says that the law which Barrère had introduced, but which Robespierre, we know, is very supportive of, which said that no English or Hanoverian soldier should be taken alive. In other words, they should be put to death rather than being captured. Robespierre on the night of the 8th of Thermidor saying, that's not being enforced. We should enforce it. He is that the terror is absolutely at the heart of what he's doing right through to the 8th of Thermidor. In the long term, or even the middle term, moderation of the terror maybe once the work of cultural change and the cult of supreme being done its best. But on the other hand, to get there, where we'll get a bit, the revolution will be wading through blood. It must be said it was wading through blood anyway, because of course he and his supporters were put to death in very large numbers the next day.
So why would he make such a terrible miscalculation on the 8th of Thermidor?
Well, again, this is why, we're all puzzling about this, and I should say that my approach to Robespierre, which is on my recent work, is really looking at, the night of particularly the day of the 9th. And what I've tried to do is focus on the actions of that day, both in terms of what's going on in Paris, among the people of Paris, but also in the assembly, and also maybe in Robespierre's mind as far as we can and reconstruct it. So not looking for his behavior so much in the history of what went before, but actually trying to see if we can tease it out of what actually happened. But when you look at 8th of Thermidor, again, we're sort of spoiled by history because we assume, he knew that everything was going to happen the next day. In fact, it's rather extraordinary that it happens the next day. This is not the first time that Robespierre's had his back against the wall, not the first time that he's had to do a big exercise in crisis management. And if we look back at his career in a number of places, we could go back to the Champ de Mars, but we could look at the expulsion of the Girondins or the overthrow of the king. What is very characteristic of Robespierre is putting it out there at a quite early stage in debate. In other words, saying an extreme things, not himself organizing those extreme things, because we know he's not a street fighter, he's not a faction leader in that sort of on the streets of Paris type way, but putting down a marker, if you like, a direction of travel, which he then hopes through the Jacobin Club, but also through the popular movement, will move through to the people of Paris. So my feeling is that, in fact, on the 9th of Thermidor, he thinks he's in another of those moments. It's a very big moment because that program of purging that he's put down is more ambitious and more extreme than anything that he's put down before. But it's not unusual. I mean, what is really, really unusual on the day of the 9th of Thermidor is the National Assembly saying, let's get an army together. Let's mobilize the National Guard and let's attack the Commune in its lair, in the Hôtel de Ville. After the 31st of May and 2nd of June, there are people say, why didn't the convention arm itself? And people say, well, no, that's not constitutional. It wouldn't have that right. So I think, people are always fighting, generals are always fighting the last war. I think revolutionary politicians are always fighting the last journée, and they assume that their journée will come from the people and that the people will have been mobilized, if you like, over time and then will take action. I think that's what Robespierre has done. I think he was as shocked as anyone I mean,
yes, I largely agree about that, but I think that the dominant emotion, as Marisa Linton has stressed around the night of Thermidor, is confusion. I think that I would agree with what, as part of the explanation, that the old analyses of Marxist historians like Roudet and Sabul have got something to them about the way in which sans-culottes have been alienated not only by the purge of the Hébertistes and their leaders, but also by economic measures. But one other factor where I know that you disagree with me, and I know Hervé Levet does as well, is about Robespierre's state of mind, because I think that too many historians, and I think Ruth Skur is one of them actually, write about Robespierre as if he's as if he's a brain on stilts, as if he's simply a walking ideology. He's the personification of an ideology, when in fact we know a good deal about his health, his physique, his lifestyle. I mean, one of the things I was able to do was to trace 6 or 8 periods of illness during the revolution, and while there's no incontrovertible evidence about his absence of a month before the 9th of Thermidor, that's due to a particular illness, I think the fact that in 1794 he has absences from political life of 5, 4, then 4 weeks, it may well suggest that here is a man like everybody else who's under enormous pressure, who's exhausted, but because of his very ascetic lifestyle, it's another occasion where, in fact, you could be excused for thinking this man is actually cracking up. I mean, he's in trouble. Certainly earlier in the revolution, there are moments where he says, I'm exhausted, I can't go on. Other people say it too. At the start of 1794, there's no doubt that, in fact, he's seriously ill. So I do think that even though we disagree about whether this is, whether we can say with any certainty in July 1794 that he's really fumbling psychologically, I think we need to be aware that these are all people who are at the end of their tethers. They're terrified. They're looking over their shoulders. I think Robespierre in that situation, even though strategically you say he's made some very adroit choices, putting things out there in the past. In Australia we call it dog whistling. It's when you get the sheep running. I think that I think that in July 1794, I think there's also an element where if it's a dog whistle, it's hopelessly wrong, because the sheep have all run in the other direction.
Yes, I mean, I think we disagree on this, but I think, funnily enough, our logic and methodology hasn't been dissimilar at all, because we're looking for this extraordinary moment. We're saying, well, let's look for recurrences of behavior in the past, which might explain that. And you're finding this in illness. My take is, I'm not convinced by the illness thing, because although I agree, he certainly talks the language of illness all the time, as others do, but he's always done that. And, he's sort of putting his life on the line even before the French Revolution in some of those legal briefs. So there is a language of sacrifice and martyrdom, as you mentioned earlier, that he's very into. When he is ill, it's February and March, I think, isn't it, that he has a serious illness.
Yes.
That becomes the talk of Paris. And
yes,
we have
that's right.
Red queues, and the sections are sending around people to see how he's getting on, and he is completely out of public life in that period. Well, in those 4, 5, 6 weeks, whatever it is, exactly, before 9th of Thermidor, none of that is happening. There isn't talk of illness at all out by anyone apart from him, as I say, on the 8th of Thermidor. And the other thing for me is that, which I think is important, is that he's withdrawn from the Committee of Public Safety. He's not at the convention, but he goes very regularly to as Hervé Levet says, to the Jacobin Club.
He goes 8 times in 4 weeks.
I've got.
I counted today.
14 out of 24 meetings over 6 weeks, which is two Jacobin meetings a week in which he talks, and of course there are others which he might not have said anything. Should be said, some of those he missed were the president of the Jacobins at that time was Fouché, and we all know he hated Fouché's guts, so actually absenting himself from there might be expected. So to me, he isn't absent from political life. I don't think illness is disqualifying him from thinking through the revolution. I think the Jacobins for him have become a very important link to the people. I think, in that he thinks the convention is becoming rotten almost. These plots are getting to the heart of the convention. His heart is, he's a Democrat. He might be a terrorist, but he still thinks the people is somehow the center of should be the center of his attention. So going to the Jacobins is for him a way of reaching out to the people of Paris. It's interesting, on the 8th of Thermidor, as we know, his speech doesn't go down very well in the National Assembly, a very long speech, and people stand up and oppose it. And there's a big debate, as you remember, about it not being published and not sent out to the to the provinces. Well, then he goes that evening to the Jacobin Club, repeats the very same speech. And people say, well, that means it will get out because it'll go out through the Jacobin network. It is a way of reaching out to the people. So for me, his head is in the right place. Even though they are under tremendous pressure, I take that completely. I agree his health is probably fragile, but for me, he's still operating as a politician right through that period. And I don't think it's a miscalculation in terms of or a massive miscalculation that needs the explanation of irrationality to see his actions on the 8th of Thermidor. It's not so different to sort of things he's done before, and he thinks he's got time on his side, and I think he doesn't have time on his side.
No, and certainly there's no way that I'd want to suggest that one can explain his behaviour by someone who is mentally ill. I'm not saying that at all. I simply think that I think it's a factor for everybody in positions of power in the middle of 1794. They are absolutely exhausted and fed up and terrified. I think in his case there is evidence that it is exacerbated because, as his close friends say, he does not look after himself. He's perfectly happy with some watered down wine and half an orange. And there are certainly cases where he does fall ill. I guess one of the things that we could maybe recommend by way of wrapping this up is that if people can bear it, they should read that full speech on the 8th of Thermidor, which will test their patience. But as you say, it's an extraordinarily long and rambling speech. And the question is, and if you look at the many of the great historians of the French Revolution who've read that speech, I'm thinking as far back as R.R. Palmer or J.M. Thompson, they have very different readings of that speech. It's not a simple matter to codify just what is he up to here, which I guess takes us back to where I started from, and that is he's not around to actually answer our questions, unfortunately.
Yes, no, I think as a result of that, and as a result of things we've been talking about, that we will still have a Robespierre problem. Robespierre debates will continue. We can be sure of that, Peter.
Colin, I want to have one little joke at the end, but it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for contributing. I'm sure that colleagues will find it very interesting, and I hope we will have an online debate with many of them around the world. But I thought, in terms of the Robespierre problem, people might be interested in this little artifact. This is actually the cover of the English and American edition of my biography of Robespierre, which has just appeared it's got a painting of Robespierre in 1783 when he's just won his first big law case. It's just appeared in Italian with this cover. Now, this is
I recognize. Yeah,
this is the reconstruction of Robespierre's face from his supposed death mask, which was undertaken by two French forensic scientists at the end of 2013. They reconstructed his face, I think, with a bit of an agenda to turn him into a monster. But of course, there was no death mask. And it was simply that Madame Tussaud had fled the French Revolution and thought in her new waxworks it would be a very good idea to have a bust of Robespierre. She had one made. So it's just an example of, I had no say in this cover, by the way. I was outraged when I saw what they'd done. But it's just an example of the way in which the Robespierre problem simply will not go away. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you.